turned increasingly to, starting about 9 years ago, to writing books for children, anywhere from ages 8 to adult, fiction and nonfiction, mostly with a focus on science. And a few years ago, with my partners here, I started a small publishing company, Tumblehome Learning. Today, I want to talk to you about some very interesting women of science and medicine over 4 centuries from 8 countries, primarily European and the US. I don't expect, we're going to sort of whip through a lot of these women, so I don't expect you necessarily to remember them specifically, but I can send you a copy of the slides. The women's stories come from 2 books, Magnificent Minds and Remarkable Minds. We have some for sale at the front of the room, but we can also give you coupons to buy them inexpensively off our website. But primarily what I want is to give you a sense of how women over 4 centuries gradually claimed their intellectual heritage and their intellectual identity as scientists. And I love to come and give this talk to schools. I've talked to from 4th grade up, so just keep that in mind as well. It's always a little bit different. The origin of these books was a show at a bibliophiles club in New York called the Grolier Club. 3 elderly curators decided they wanted to put together an exhibit with artifacts from women of science, and over 2 years they gathered these artifacts for 32 women. And as the exhibit was about to close down, they decided they would like to have it made into a book for young people, and through a friend they got in touch with me, and I gave them a lot of advice about going with a large publisher, but eventually they decided to come to Tumblehome Learning, and I became the writer for the book. It was really fun, and they were my fact checkers and assistants, helping me identify images. So the book has a lot of pictures in each chapter about a woman. There's also a sidebar saying something interesting that was happening in history at the time, another that goes a little deeper into some aspect of the science, and there's a timeline that shows what was going on in the rest of the world, or in arts and politics at the time. So it's helpful for sort of situating scientific advances in their time. When I start to talk with girls, I say, can you tell me some famous women in science and medicine? Ones that are not living today. And of course, they all come up with Marie Curie, and then it gets very thin after that. They say Jane Goodall, and I say, no, she's still living. So here are some other women, some of whom you may recognize and some of you may not. So you can shout out the answer if you know it. We don't often think of this person as a woman of science, but no, she's actually Florence Nightingale, and she was a pioneer in the use of statistics for public health, and she developed some new ways of showing statistics.
Marie Curie's wife.
This is, what's that?
No, sorry, it was
Someone else's wife. This is actually, her name is Émilie la Marquise du Châtelet. She was a physicist. She translated Newton's Principia into French. She lived in the 1700s. She was known also as Voltaire's lover. This one you probably know, some of you? Who said it? Someone said it. Rosalind Franklin. Augusta Ada Byron, often noted as the first computer programmer. And Grace Hopper, the smallest and oldest admiral in the Navy at the time she finally retired. She was 80. But she was developed the first compiler and was a very important pioneer in computer science. She did a lot of the work behind COBOL, which is still used in 80% of business computers worldwide. And these are all Nobel Prize winners. I'll just go through them fast. We'll see some of them again. Rosalind Yallow, Barbara McClintock, Corn Genetics and Jumping Genes. Dorothy Crowfoot Hodgkin, The Structure of Molecules, Penicillin, Vitamin B12, and Insulin. Gertie Corey, The Corey Cycle, Fundamental to Biochemistry. Rita Levy Montalcini, Nerve Growth Factor. Maria Mayer, Nuclear Shells and Spin Orbit Coupling. So the structure of the nucleus. Okay, but just to get into some themes about these women. First of all, I'd like to start by telling you about the earliest woman in the two books. She's one of my favorites, Louise Port, and she also represents the fact that many of these women's lives were convulsed and in some cases given new opportunities through war. She was a housewife living outside of Paris when the religious wars, the future Henry II, attacked her village while her husband was away, and she and her mother-in-law packed their furniture and fled into the walls of Paris, where they lived for a while by selling furniture and doing needlework. But then Louise said, well, my husband's a barber surgeon. I spent some time with these physicians. I think I'm going to learn to be a midwife. And she started off by helping the midwife, the child of her landlady, and she began practicing in the Latin Quarter. And she became a very well-known midwife. Eventually she became midwife to the Queen of France, and she delivered the future Louis XIII. She decided that she was going to write a textbook. The first woman, she said, I am the first woman practicing my art to pick up the pen. And she wrote a book with a really long title about childbirth and women's disorders, and it included what to do in the case of a breech delivery, how to deliver the placenta, all sorts of things. And she was very well known, but then a royal cousin died a week after giving birth. And the physicians, eager to duck responsibility for the fact that she'd been feverish and ill all through her pregnancy, blamed it on Louise Bourgeois. And although she protested, she didn't go quietly. She actually published a pamphlet saying, I will read it to you because it's so saucy. She said, I have to put on my glasses, I'm sorry. Based on your report, you have no knowledge of the placenta and the womb of the woman, either before or after delivery. In order to know the secret of women's maladies, it is necessary to have worked with midwives and to have assisted at several deliveries, as your great master and legislator Hippocrates did, who in treating women's maladies consulted midwives, deferring to their judgment. And the physicians jumped back, and one of them wrote a pamphlet saying, no longer involve yourself in responding to doctors. Do not glorify yourself with the name of midwife. Foresee what can be drawn from your presumption in your writings, and no longer talk with such haughtiness against the men who are more practiced and more happy than you in the profession that you do. And she was hounded out of court. Although she was probably right. They said there was some retained placenta. She said, you were all there at the delivery and you examined the placenta and you said it was fine then. So she continued practicing in the Latin Quarter for the rest of her life and made revisions to her book, which was an important textbook of obstetrics for the next 2 centuries. This is Maria Kunitz, who was the most accomplished mathematical astronomer of her day. She and her husband constantly fled the religious wars. They were Protestants. They actually sheltered for many years in a Cistercian monastery where the people were very kind to them despite the fact that they were Protestants. And she worked on the Rudolphine tables, which were Kepler's astronomical tables that he had done under the sponsorship of King Rudolph that predicted eclipses and all sorts of astronomical events. She did a lot of mathematics, resolving them to be more easy for people to use, correcting a lot of mistakes along the way. And her husband wrote in the introduction to her book, basically, my wife really did this without my help. She's the one who did it, even though she's a woman. So. These are three Jewish women who all had to flee Europe with the rise of the Nazis. Lisa Meitner, who we'll mention again later. Emmy Noether, who was a founder of abstract algebra, a very accomplished mathematician who went to teach at Bryn Mawr but died a year later of an ovarian tumor. And Marietta Blau, who fled Austria, and Albert Einstein found her a job in Mexico where she could be safe and teach but not continue very much of her physics work, which had been recording on photographic plates the effects of cosmic rays and their interactions with atoms in the atmosphere. And during the war, Rita Levy Montalcini, who is an Italian Jew, first moved when the racial laws were passed saying that that Jews couldn't work in universities or in the professions. She moved to Belgium to keep doing her research on chick embryos there. And then when it appeared that Belgium was going to fall again, also she moved back to Turin, where she was born, and then moved out into the country, and she did her experiments in the bedroom in a little hood that her brother built for her. She would go out and tell the peasants that she needed to buy some fertilized eggs for her child, although she didn't have a child. Then after the war, she went on a 6-month fellowship to the University of Missouri at St. Louis and stayed there the rest of her life. It was there that she made the discovery of nerve growth factor, which was the first of all the growth factors, of which we have hundreds today. So those are women affected by war and by Nazi prejudice, I would say. The next little theme that I want to bring out among these women is the importance of education in their lives and the various roles that their parents played in that education. I mentioned before Ada Byron. She was the daughter of the poet Lord Byron and his wife, whom he called the Princess of Parallelograms because she loved mathematics. The couple actually broke up after a few months of marriage while Ada's mother was pregnant with her, and her mother was convinced that her father was mad and bad. He'd had an affair with his half-sister, Augusta Byron, and she prevented her daughter and her father from ever seeing each other. Moreover, she decided that she was going to raise Ada with a very strong mathematical education to counteract the genetic effects of her father's wild, poetic nature. So she hired a series of governesses, but between them she taught Ada herself, and if Ada didn't perform well enough, her mother locked her in a closet until she came out willing to write a letter of apology. And despite this, Ada grew up loving mathematics. She was bedridden for a couple of years after a bout with measles. I don't know if some of that was a little bit hysterical. As soon as she got out of bed, she tried to run away with her tutor, her mother, and 3 women she called the Furies brought her back. And she always was sort of a wild child, Ada Byron. But she got to know Charles Babbage, who had created the analytical engine, first the difference engine and then the analytical engine, and she helped him translate what he was doing to the general public. And in the course of doing that, said to him, we should show that this machine that you're developing could be used to solve a very new problem. Give me some difficult mathematical problem and tell me what the method would be, and I'll write the steps that would have to go into your analytical engine. And that is how she became credited with writing the first computer program, which didn't get tested because Babbage never actually managed to build his machine. He ran out of grant money and he argued a lot with his engineer. And Ada Byron died young of, I believe, uterine cancer. It seems like, don't tell your girls this, but being a woman scientist seems to be associated with a lot of cancers. Anyway, Sophie Kovalevskaya was a young woman who was growing up in Russia during the time of the basically liberalization under Tsar Alexander II. The serfs were freed when she was 11 years old. She and her sister, her older sister, really wanted to get a higher education, but there was no higher education for girls in Russia at the time, and their father, a retired general, was happy to have them educated up to a certain point, but not to leave the country for a further education. You needed the permission of your father or your husband to leave, so Sophie, during a dinner party, ran off, leaving a note for her father, and spent the night with a young geology student. So her father had to let her get married, and they left for Germany soon after. She attached herself to Karl Weierstrass, who when this young woman came to his door, thought to politely send her away by giving her a series of very difficult mathematical problems. But she came back a few days later with all the solutions, and he basically tutored her until for a PhD degree. And she went on to do important mathematical work and sometimes write plays and have affairs, and she had a great time. But she represents both the importance of education and the difficulty of getting it at the time in the 1800s in Europe. Barbara McClintock in America did very well in high school. Her father was a homeopathic physician who was away at World War I when Barbara was ready to go to college, and her mother said, no, I don't want, you shouldn't go to college, nobody wants to marry an educated woman. So she ended up working and studying in the library at night until her father came home and said, of course she can go to college. And she became the first woman in her family to go to college. She wanted to major in genetics, but women were not allowed in that major at Cornell, so she majored in botany, but she became a profoundly original researcher in genetics, doing work in corn, since she came out of botany, that extended work that had previously been done in fruit flies, and making such strange discoveries that other biochemists said, we don't really want to look at your stuff, it's so weird, until they found out that what she was doing in corn with jumping genes and rearrangement of the genome could also be seen in bacteria, and she was 80 when she received her Nobel Prize. Florence Nightingale represents another kind of woman, well educated at home by her father. She would get up at 4 o'clock in the morning to study her Greek and Latin, but this was all for the purpose of having her grow up to be a gentlewoman and lady of the neighborhood. There was certainly never expected that she would go out and enter a profession, and she had profound disagreements with her family about that. She was a very dutiful daughter, and what she wanted to do was be a nurse, but nurses were notorious for being drunkenness and providing sexual favors on demands to surgeons, and it was not a thing that a middle-class lady would do. So for years she stayed at home being obedient. She wrote this unfinished novel called Cassandra, in which one of the characters cries out, why has woman passion, intellect, moral activity, these three, and a place in society where no one of the three can be exercised? She had suitors, her family really wanted her to marry, but she just couldn't see for herself that life as a gentlewoman. And finally at age 30, after bouts with depression and whatnot, she did go and managed to get herself some rudimentary nurse training in Germany, and then took a position as the head nurse of a society for retired gentlewomen, a home for retired gentlewomen. And the following year, her friend, the Secretary of War, asked her to pull together the group to go to the Crimea and deal with the British soldiers who were dying there. She did so. She worked for about a year before she herself fell ill with what we now think is brucellosis, which kept her often bedridden and often in pain for the rest of her life. But her major discovery was that it was hygiene. First of all, it was sickness more than wounds that was killing the soldiers. And second, the thing that made it the biggest difference was hygiene. She came home, she helped to inform a royal commission. Queen Victoria said, I wish we had more like her running the country. And she put forth just hundreds of letters and studies over the course of her life until she died at 90, that not only established nursing as a profession, but really helped establish public health based on information and statistics. So why is it so hard for women? I asked the kids. And this really goes back to the foundations of Western science. Aristotle said that women were partway between slaves and men in terms of their capacity, that they were envious, lacking in proper pride, jealous, overly passionate, etc., etc. And the real problem with women is this: they have a uterus. Professor Giovanni Volpi wrote in the 1700s that the fluids women require for their reproductive purposes make their fibers too weak and flaccid to sustain concentrated activity in the brain. Of course, right around the same time, we had the example of Laura Bassi. She was one of the remarkable women who was educated at home by her father to be a prodigy, and she started holding disputes with learned men in her home in the 1700s. She, at the age of 21, defended, I think it was 49 theses before the faculty of the University of Bologna, which was how you got a PhD in those days, was by studying up on certain questions and being ready to hold forth about them. And the University of Bologna probably did this partly for a publicity stunt. Things were kind of quiet, and they gave the first PhD to a woman in Europe. It was Laura Bassi. She was expected to go home and write Latin verse and remain a virgin for the rest of her life. But instead, she married a physicist and insisted on giving lectures. She talked to her old friend, who had been a cardinal and was now the Pope. He was establishing a group of college scholars in the city I just mentioned, whose name has just left me, Bologna, which was a papal state, a group of 24 scholars who would have to give a lecture of independent new research, something really different, every year. And she convinced him to make her the 25th scholar. For the rest of her life, basically she gave a lecture every year, even while bearing 9 or perhaps 12 children. We've kind of lost count. So she proved that her reproductive fluids didn't get too much in the way of her accomplishment. She eventually became the highest paid faculty member at the University of Bologna and the chair of experimental physics. She and her husband had already been for many years teaching physics to visiting scholars from all over Europe. He did more of the demonstrations and she did more of the mathematics. She's great. I love Laura Bassi. I love most of these women. I mentioned, okay, so the next thing I was going to say was, for some of these women, the way that they addressed these issues of whether they really had a right to an intellectual life was that initially, as they wrote anonymously or pseudonymously under an assumed name. I mentioned before Emilie la Marquise du Châtelet, who was raised, she was something of a prodigy, but at the age of 17, she married a soldier. She was a member of the lesser nobility, and he was a viscount. He was often away at war, and he proved to be a very tolerant husband. He didn't seem to mind. They both sort of went their own way as far as love affairs. But in her 20s, she was a society woman of Paris with 20 servants and 2 garages. But she started to make friends with a group of men who were more intellectual, and she asked one of them, Maupertuis, to teach her mathematics. Around the same time, she fell in love with Voltaire, who was 12 years her senior. And when Voltaire was, he had already spent a couple of times in the Bastille. He was quite wealthy from his writing. But he published letters from the English, which was about his view of the liberal political thought of England. The book was banned. He was threatened again with imprisonment. He fled to the country, and Emily and her husband decided to shelter him at their chateau of Syrie. And in fact, her husband got him his sentence changed to house arrest. So Voltaire and Emily lived very happily at Syrie with a lot of intellectual visitors, and they studied mathematics and physics, and he wrote his plays, and they performed amateur theatricals in the evening. She started off thinking of herself primarily as his muse. He was interested in Newton's physics, and he wrote a book about it called Elements of Newton's Philosophy that Emily actually wrote large portions of. And he acknowledged her, not in print on the title page, but in his frontispiece, where you see Newton here with the light of enlightenment coming through him and being reflected by a mirror held up by Emily down to Voltaire writing here at his desk. That's his tribute to her. Then after that, they went on to both compete in a competition for an essay about the nature of fire. Neither of them won the competition, but both their works were published, and by then Emily was beginning to write under her own name. Before that, she had done some translations. And her final work, begun when she was 39, was this massive translation of Newton's Principia. Now, at that time, translations were quite free with a lot of commentary. So she wrote 239 pages of commentary and examples. And although Newton had not used calculus in his Principia, she had studied and learned calculus and used calculus in sample sort of problems and demonstrations that she wrote in her book. The book was finished 1 week before she had a daughter and died a week later at age 42. So she had been in this real rush to finish the book when she managed to do it. The book wasn't published for 10 years, but it became a very important text in introducing Newtonian physics to Europe, and supposedly it's still the only translation of Newton's Principia into French. This is another French woman, much more sedate than Emily, born 14 years later, Madame Marie Charlotte Geneviève Thiroux d'Arconville. She was the daughter of a tax farmer. It's a person who bought from the government the right to collect taxes in a certain area. So it was a way that the government got its money up front and was certain of it, and then the tax farmer could go out and make a profit by collecting taxes from the countryside. And when she was quite young, I can't remember, maybe 15, she was married to another tax farmer. And she was a sedate but active society lady, going to the theater, going to parties, until in her early 20s she developed a severe case of smallpox, and whether it was the brush with death or the fact of being scarred with smallpox, she retired from society thereafter and devoted herself to intellectual works. And over the course of her life, into her 80s, she wrote history, essays, translated works by others, translated books about science, and also did some scientific research of her own. She attended, at that time, there were lectures given in the King's Garden in Paris, and there were lectures given on anatomy and lectures given on chemistry. You could go and, over the course of several months, see 9 cadavers being dissected. If you went early in the morning and held your nose, or there was a series of lectures on chemistry, and one of her chemistry teachers suggested that she translate from the English chemistry text by a fellow named Shaw. And she did that, but she was always doing more than one thing at once. So at the same time, she translated a little handbook about the bones, a handbook of osteology from the English. And she decided that to make this book available or accessible to a larger audience, she wanted to illustrate it. So she went to a professor of anatomy and drawing at the Sorbonne named J.J. Su, and together they created a whole series of these engravings, which she oversaw very closely. And this book, she said she wanted it to be accessible to everyone, but it ended up being a book this big, very expensive, so it was your ultimate tabletop book, and not everyone could have it. But part of what's interesting about this is that this is the female skeleton from the book, and it's a little interesting because, first of all, the lower ribs are squeezed, which I had been told and read they thought was due to the person wearing corsets, but someone told me earlier this week that they didn't have corsets then, so I'm not sure. But the skull is also relatively small, and the sort of common wisdom at the time was that women, being less capable, had smaller skulls compared to their body size, when actually the opposite is true. Relatively, women have larger skulls compared to body size than men. So it's kind of interesting that this particular inaccuracy is reflected in this book. After working on these two books, D'Arconville decided that she was really interested in a topic that may seem a little strange to you, putrefaction. There's some putrefaction in the Zondi book, by the way, or how things rot. She thought this was really at the core of physics and chemistry and biology, because it was how things changed from one thing into another. It had been of real interest to alchemists in the past. So she did a series of experiments over many years where she recorded the weather, the temperature, exactly what she added to these meat or vegetables, and how she stored them, and came up with her own conclusions about that. The most important conclusion was the best way to keep things from rotting was to keep them away from the air. And this was actually an important finding. Her work was cited until the emergence of the germ theory of disease. But she's the first woman chemist who was really doing her own independent research. There were others that were mixing sort of remedies and things like that. In mathematics, do any of you know Sophie Charmagne? She was a young French girl who grew up during the French Revolution, and she was reading in her father's library as the revolution was storming outside about Archimedes and about the fact that when the Romans invaded Syracuse, he was so caught up in doing a problem that when a soldier called him to attention, he didn't answer, and the soldier ran him through, which upset the Roman leaders who wanted to meet Archimedes. But anyway, she decided, instead of deciding mathematics sounds dangerous, she thought, this must be a really great subject if someone can be that involved in it, and she devoted herself to the study of mathematics. Napoleon set up a school of technology, a Polytechnic Institute. Women were not allowed. So she took over the identity of a male student who had dropped out and got the notes from other students and then sent in her solutions to problems. And the instructor, Lagrange, was so impressed with the improvement that this student had made, he insisted on meeting with the student and was very surprised to find she was a woman. She also corresponded with Gauss, but under the name of that male student for many years, until there was a war between France and Germany, and she was worried about Gauss, remembering Archimedes, so she sent word through a general who was a friend of her father's to find out if he was okay, and he was really puzzled as to who this young woman was who was inquiring after him. But then they came to know each other. She did important work in number theory, some underlying work from Fermat's last theorem, and also did work on Chladni patterns. I guess I didn't put a picture of that in here, but if you can see in some museums, if there's a metal plate on a metal stake and you sprinkle sand or salt on the top and then run a violin bow along the edge, the sand arranges itself into these strange regular patterns. And Napoleon offered a prize for whoever could figure out the mathematics behind why it did that. And so other mathematicians said, this is too hard and it's crazy. But she tried 3 times, and finally on the 3rd time, she won the Prize for this discovery. And then she died young. So after these women who hid their identity comes Elizabeth Fulham, who did not hide her identity, but we know very little about her actually. She was an English woman married to a physician who was active in Edinburgh, and what we know about her comes from this book she wrote, which is about the art of dyeing, D-Y-E, dyeing. She was interested in if she could use chemical reactions to make tiny flecks of metal attach themselves to cloth to create shimmering cloths, and she hoped to create a new art form. Her husband and others told her this probably wouldn't work, but she said that not wanting to be indolent, she decided to amuse herself in this way, and over 10 years, every time that she could pull together enough money, she bought some gold or copper or lead or tin and some ether or water in glassware. She created these solutions and dissolved. She was the first to show that you could really make these aqueous solutions of metals, of metallic salts. And I don't think I have it, I was going to read to you. But, and she managed to get the metal, to get the cloth to dye somewhat. She talked to a famous chemist, we don't know who, but it was probably Joseph Priestley, and he said he would present her work at the Royal Academy if she liked, but she decided, as she said, to escape the furious, prowling plagiary, she would write a book herself, which she did. And she carefully recorded all of her experiments thematically, and the two important discoveries she made were redox reactions and the role of catalysts. She found that water was a catalyst for some of her work and that it was not consumed, and she figured out a two-step chemical reaction. Her work, the cloths never became the beautiful, full-scale shimmering cloths she hoped. They would dye for a while, but then they would sort of revert, which was the redox reaction running the other way. But she could be seen as sort of a prehistory contributor to the art of photography. She was made an honorary member of the Philadelphia Academy of Science for this book. That's Joseph Priestley. So what else did women do? Well, Mary Putnam Jacoby was the daughter of the publisher George Putnam. She grew up before the Civil War, and during the Civil War she decided she wanted to study medicine. First she studied pharmacy, she got a degree, then she went off during the Civil War to study medicine at the Women's College of Pennsylvania. Her father offered to pay her a nice allowance if she wouldn't do that, because he thought it wasn't a suitable profession for a woman. But she got her degree, she came back, started practicing in New York, but just really felt that her education wasn't adequate, so she arranged to go to France to try and study at the University of Paris. She supported herself by writing articles or sometimes by tutoring. She went to Paris, she taught herself French. When her father sent her money for a new dress, she asked if she could spend it on a microscope again instead. And she eventually got her doctorate degree in France and came back to the US, where she decided she was really going to try and spread scientific medicine, especially to women. She married Abraham Jacoby, who was the father of American pediatrics. And around this time, a physician wrote a pamphlet called A Fair Chance for the Girls, something like that, in which he said that because of the rigors of their menstrual cycle, women were not strong enough to enter their professions, and that it was just really unfair to them to allow them to think that they could. So Mary Putnam Jacoby decided that she was going to study this, and she got a whole bunch of women and followed them through their menstrual cycle, taking their temperature, their pulse, and their blood pressure. This is a little device called a sphygmogram, where the lever is lifted by the force of the pulse and actually gives you a measure of the blood pressure as well as the pulse. And she published this anonymously, entered it for the Harvard Boylston Prize, and her essay won the prize. And this was probably 70 years before Harvard allowed women into its medical school. She went on to do a lot of other important research and establishing mother and child care clinics, teaching materia medica, which was kind of pharmacology to women. And her last research paper was a description of a brain tumor, from, as she said, from which the author died. She knew she was dying, but she wrote a long study of this brain tumor. So women were gradually being allowed into higher education. When Mary Putnam Jacoby managed to talk herself into the University of Paris, she actually had to enter the lecture hall from a different door, and she had to sit in something that's sort of like the witness dock in a courtroom, so she wouldn't disturb the men. French women couldn't go to the University of Paris at the time, but women continued to gradually get a chance at education. Lise Meitner was a young Austrian woman who studied physics and wanted to go to Germany for advanced studies. She already had a PhD, but she didn't think it was that good. She wanted to work with Max Planck, who had said, the laws of nature cannot be ignored without grave danger. So although there are a few rare women who can achieve in the sciences, but he said that this grave danger would be most likely manifest in the next generation. So you could become a scientist, but your children would probably be, congenitally abnormal or something. However, he actually ended up being very impressed by Lise Meitner, and she studied with him. She started doing research with a young chemist, a nuclear chemist named Otto Hahn. They worked together for many years. During World War I, while he was away, actually on the front, working with chemical weapons, she continued their research and discovered protactinium, the precursor for actinium. She put his name first on the paper because any chemistry paper, they put his name first. After the war, they both worked at the Carl Wilhelm Institute, where she ended up heading the group on nuclear physics. And before World War II, they both became very involved with this question of, were there transuranic elements? If you took uranium and bombarded it with neutrons, you found new compounds, and the idea was that these were compounds that were further down the periodic table. The Joliot-Curies in Paris were working on this. Fermi was working on it in Italy. And then the Nazis invaded Austria. Lise Meitner lost her Austrian passport. She was a Jew. She couldn't work at the institute anymore, and eventually she fled Germany. Einstein helped her get a position in Sweden. Otto Hahn gave her his mother's engagement ring in case she had to bribe a border guard. And 2 months after Lise Meitner went to Sweden, Hahn wrote her and said, it's really strange, but one of these compounds looks a lot like barium, one of these products. She wrote back and said, that is very strange, but you're a good chemist. And then she went walking with her nephew, Otto Frisch, and they figured out what was going on using the liquid drop model of the nucleus. They figured out that if a neutron hit it in the right way, it could actually split into 2 daughter nuclei and give off 3 neutrons. They understood what experiment they would need to do to prove that this was the mechanism. Otto Frisch went back to Niels Bohr's lab in Copenhagen and did the research, and when Hahn published his paper saying, I've split the atom, she published a paper saying, this is what's going on. After the war, this led to the atom bomb, which she certainly didn't really anticipate at the time. She was asked to work on the Manhattan Project. She said no, and there's all sorts of interesting things about what happened on the German side. But they didn't create an atom bomb. After the war, Otto Hahn received the Nobel Prize in chemistry for this discovery. Lisa Meitner was nominated but never won the prize in physics. And her contribution was a little bit, it's only recently people have been really talking about it before. The irony is that Hahn said she didn't have anything to do with this discovery, but it was work they had been doing together for years and years that she had invited him into. It's just that the actual final piece of enlightenment happened 2 months after she was driven out of the country. And it's a contrast to the loyalty she showed him during World War I when she was doing the work and he was away. All right, I think we're running on here, so I'm going to skip through Hertha Ayrton, suffragette and electrical engineer, a great person. She sheltered women who had been released from prison after their hunger striking. She nursed them back to health so they could be rearrested and put back in prison. Gertrude Elyon is a woman that I think you could really could inspire some of your girl students. She was a chemist who attacked these problems, gout, herpes, childhood leukemia, through basically creating analogs of purines that are involved in DNA synthesis. The idea was that all cells are synthesizing DNA all the time, but bacterial cells or tumor cells are turning over more rapidly and synthesizing more DNA. So if we interfere with that process, maybe we can affect those problems. So this is the generic purine. These are 2 drugs used in childhood leukemia. Gout, she was the first, her team was the first to develop an effective antiviral. It's a huge seller for herpes. And the team that she trained went on to discover AZT, the first effective drug for AIDS. She couldn't get into graduate school because she was a woman, but she ended up winning a Nobel Prize with her boss and mentor, George Hitchens. The last woman I was going to mention to you was Rosalind Gold, also won a Nobel Prize for radio immunoassay. And I just want to read to you what she said during her Nobel Prize acceptance. She said, "We still live in a world in which a significant fraction of people, including women, believe that a woman belongs and wants to belong exclusively in the home. That a woman should not aspire to achieve more than her male counterparts, and particularly not more than her husband. Even now, women with exceptional qualities for leadership sense from their parents, teachers, and peers that they must be harder working, accomplish more, and yet are less likely to receive appropriate rewards than are men. We cannot expect in the immediate future that all women who seek it will achieve full equality of opportunity. But if women are to start moving toward that goal, we must believe in ourselves or no one else will believe in us. We must match our aspirations with the competence, courage, and determination to succeed. And we must feel a personal responsibility to ease the path for those who come afterwards." So these 2 books, Magnificent Minds and Remarkable Minds, with these women and a number of others, are available from Tumblehome Learning. We also have some for sale here today. Barnes will tell you how much they cost. Tumblehome Learning also publishes the Galactic Academy of Science books. We invited each of you to take one in return for just signing up for our newsletter. These are adventure and mystery stories involving science, history of science, and a little bit of time travel by 2 middle school students who are members of the Galactic Academy of Science. So thank you. And I'd be happy to answer any questions or sign any books or talk to you about anything you like. Sorry it was such a whirlwind. I will say that, as I said before, I do like to come talk to kids, and I can modify the talk to whatever level is appropriate. So that's another possibility.
Florence Nightingale.
Yes. Brucellosis is an infection that's caught from unpasteurized milk or meat of herbivores, and it causes, it's kind of an intracellular bacterium that causes initially fever, nausea, all these sorts of things. My wife, she lost all her hair, she was very ill. But then in a long term can cause fatigue, depression, aches and pains, and particularly spondylitis, which is inflammation of the back. That's very painful. Can be cured easily with antibiotics now.
What about being women like this quiet thing that you can say you have?
Well, there just weren't very many. I mean, we're talking about women starting at the beginning of the rise of science, and if you look for women before that, you know, the one name that comes up is Hypatia, who was a mathematician, but a lot of what we know about her is shaky, you know, it could be mythic. So I'm probably more interested in looking at more recent women, especially because I could begin to see the emergence of more women of color and perhaps women from the developing world. There's only one woman of color. Well, there's one Chinese woman and one African American woman in the two books. But that really reflects where the sort of traditional Western science was strong.